Where did I arrive?
Guatemala. I arrived. Guatemala.
I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
I arrived in Guatemala.
Me, AJ.
On a day of the dead.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala November
No,
3rd.
I didn't arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd.
On November
I
1st.
arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
Day of the dead.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st.
I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I wasn't angry.
No,
I wasn't angry
about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
I wasn't sad about the holidays.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
I was
AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
The holiday. Right? I was curious about the holiday.
The holiday.
Which holiday was I curious about?
The Day of the Dead.
Which holiday was I curious about? The Day of the Dead. I was curious about
the Day
of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
I was
I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. So I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
I go to the cemetery.
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery.
I went to the cemetery.
Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport?
I went to the cemetery.
Yeah, I went to the
cemetery.
Who went to the cemetery?
I went to the cemetery.
Well, me, right, AJ. I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
The cemetery.
To the cemetery, right. I went to the cemetery.
The cemetery.
When did I go to the cemetery?
I know.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead. I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead.
November 1st.
November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
To see what was happening.
What was happening.
I went to the cemetery to see what was happening.
Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
I went to the cemetery what was happening.
Me, AJ, went to the cemetery
to see what was happening.
Where was the cemetery?
In Guatemala.
In Guatemala. The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
It's a holiday.
A holiday. The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
On November 1st.
November 1st. The Day of the Dead
is on November 1st.
Was and is November 1st. So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting. Was it boring?
No, it wasn't boring.
No, it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it was interesting.
It was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel
I was
about the cemetery?
I was interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting?
It was interesting.
It was interesting.
It was
Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The holiday.
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting.
The cemetery was interesting.
When was the cemetery interesting?
On November 1st.
It was interesting
on
November the Day of the Dead.
November 1st.
November 1st. Okay, the atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, it wasn't sad.
No, the atmosphere was not sad. The atmosphere was like a party. The atmosphere was very happy. Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Happy. The atmosphere was happy.
The atmosphere was happy. The atmosphere was like a party.
Was like party.
What was like a party?
The atmosphere in the cemetery.
The atmosphere in the cemetery was like a party. Where was the atmosphere like a party?
In the cemetery. The atmosphere
in the cemetery
was
the cemetery.
Like a party.
The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party at my house?
No, at my house.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party
in the cemetery. In the cemetery.
The atmosphere was not like a party in my house. So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Where were the families sitting?
Around the grave.
Around the graves.
The families
they were sitting around the graves. Who was sitting around the graves?
Families were sitting around the grave.
The families were sitting around the graves. Were they sitting around the trees?
Not trees.
No, they weren't sitting around the trees.
They were sitting around the graves.
So, where were they sitting?
In the cemetery. Grave.
Around the graves.
Around the grave.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes.
Yes.
They were sitting around the grave of
their dead ancestors.
ancestor.
Were they sitting around the graves of their friends?
No. No friends.
Not really. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Who was sitting around the graves?
The families.
Families were sitting around the graves. Whose graves were they sitting around?
Their
Whose
dead
graves were they sitting around?
the dead ancestor. They were sitting around the grave of their dead ancestor.
Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes.
Or the graves of their friends?
They were sitting around the grave of their dead
They were
ancestor.
sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Who cleaned the graves?
The families cleaned
the families.
the grave. The family
What
cleaned the
did
grave.
they add?
They added fresh flower.
They added
fresh
flowers.
Flowers.
Did they add food?
No, they didn't add food.
No, they didn't add food. Did they add money?
No, they didn't add money.
No, they didn't add money.
Fresh flower.
They added fresh flowers. What did they clean?
They cleaned the grave.
They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean?
Their dead ancestor.
Their ancestors.
Grave.
They cleaned their ancestors' graves.
Right.
Where did they add flowers?
The graves. They
added flowers to the graves. That's right. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Good. I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, I didn't walk through the park.
I didn't walk through the park.
I walked through the cemetery. The cemetery.
Where did I walk?
The cemetery.
Through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery.
Who walked through the cemetery?
I walked through the cemetery.
I did. AJ. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery or did I walk through the park?
I walked through the cemetery.
That's right. And I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
The colorful flowers.
Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, I didn't admire the beauty of the trees.
I didn't admire the beauty of the trees. Did I admire the beauty of the children?
No, I didn't admire the beauty of the children.
Didn't admire
I admire
the children.
The beauty of
did I
all
admire?
colorful flowers.
Flowers, right? Yeah, I admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
Of all the colorful flowers.
Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
I admire the
AJ,
beauty
me,
of all the
admired
colorful
the beauty
flowers.
of all the colorful flowers. Where were the flowers?
Flower
On the graves.
On the grave.
In the cemetery. The flowers were on the graves.
In the cemetery.
In the cemetery. Were the flowers in the park?
No, it's a park.
No, they weren't in the park.
They
Were the
was
flowers
in the
in my
cemetery.
house?
They was
No,
in my
they
house.
weren't in my house.
They was
Where
in the
were
cemetery.
the flowers?
They were
The
in the
flowers
cemetery.
were on the graves in the cemetery. Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
I walked
Through the cemetery.
When did I walk through the cemetery?
Hết thời gian rồi nha.